I'm really happy to welcome Leonard Brody. Leonard is an award-winning entrepreneur, venture capitalist, best-selling author, and a two-time Emmy-nominated media visionary. Leonard has helped in raising millions of dollars for startup companies, been through one of the largest internet IPOs in history. He was the president of the Innovation and Digital Group for the Anschutz Group Company, one of the largest live sport and entertainment businesses on the planet. He is currently the co-founder and chairman of Creative Labs, a joint venture with Creative Artists Agency. And Leonard had always said to me he's a big football fan, and he calls it soccer. And then he went off and became co-owner of Coventry City Football Club. Now, for me, is that a football fan? I'm not sure, but I'm sure he can justify himself to all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, delighted to welcome Leonard Brody.
Thank you so much, Nick. I appreciate it. And really, thank you very much for having me. I am super grateful, and it's always nice to be able to get communicating with people. I'm going to try, even though you are an Arsenal fan, I won't hold that against you. But I do, I want to make sure that I can share my screen here. And we are not having a ton of luck. Let me just quickly fix something for you here, Nick, because I think your system is a bit different than mine. Hold on one sec.
No problem.
It's not letting me share, but I'm going to try. Here. This should fix it. No. You know what? It's not going to let me screen share just because of the system. So we'll keep going, and I'll keep talking through. So I think my world started a little bit differently than a typical economist's life would start. So I didn't actually begin my life as an economist, nor am I a trained economist, but most of my career has been spent in building businesses that we would think of on the digital front in the digital economy. So I started about 20 years ago developing roughly what's now about 35 startup companies, and each of them had differing moments of success, and some we took public and some we sold. But roughly about, I would say, 10 years ago, I started getting very fascinated with the process around what was going on that felt slightly different. So there was something here right after about the turn of 2010 that started to feel dramatically different. And so myself and some of the editors at Forbes started engaging in some research that really tried to answer a very simple question. How is this different? Is it different at all? Because it certainly felt around the time of 2010 that this was substantially different. And generally speaking, when you can pinpoint this moment in time, we kind of counted backwards. And so the research that we've been doing now, which started a decade ago, was really about these very moments. It was about the moment where we see these phenomenal rewrites of the planet. And so we wrote a big piece on this called The Great Rewrite, and it turned out to be more poignant than ever now than it even was 10 years ago. And you could really pinpoint that moment in time to basically the start of the iPhone. So when you went back to 2007, you could realize that there was something clearly different about what had happened in that period than the periods before it. And the best way to think about that was we were rewriting the planet from the ground up. It was almost as if you were pressing the reset button on the operating system of the planet. And it seemed very obvious, and it seemed to us to be a clear pattern. But when we started looking at it and looking at a bit more detail, we realized that, in fact, it was a clearly definable pattern. And that when you think about the world and its history, it's both complex and simple at the same time. And generally speaking, when we define something as a rewrite of the planet, these patterns of rewrites that we go through, it's not exactly easy to sort of understand in exact science, but what you're generally looking for is about a 35% shift in consumer communication behavior, typically on a global scale. And when you look at that, you can go back to about 1749. And if you count from about 1749 backwards, you will see that predominantly the world just didn't change. It was almost exactly the same. If you looked at the predominant metrics we would try to define as advancement, so infant mortality rates, life expectancy, GDP rates, prior to 1749, the world was pretty much the same. And then in 1750, when the Industrial Revolution begins, you start to see a pattern emerge. And that pattern is definable and repeatable, and we've been doing it for about 400 years. And the pattern is generally the following three cycles. So it starts with a reset. That reset, think of it as a computer, and somebody's pushing their finger on the button to reset the computer. There are typically only four causes of these resets over the last 400 years. It would be technology, financial, war, or medical. Those are your four drivers of what's actually causing the changes. Then once you hit that reset, once that finger is on the button, whether it was World War I or World War II, or it could have been the Spanish flu, it could now currently in COVID, the second phase of this pattern is when your finger comes off that button, you generally enter into a devaluatory period or a devaluation. Now, historically speaking, over the last 400 years, that devaluation period typically lasts 9 to 16 months. Could be a little shorter, could be a little longer. And as Pippa mentioned, we don't exactly know in this circumstance, but if I was a betting person and I was putting money on it, I would say the pattern would repeat. And that we are likely looking at a stage 2, which is a devaluation period of 9 to 16 months. The interesting part of it is the third step of this definable pattern is always growth. So at the end of these periods, you always begin a growth cycle, and that growth cycle is often unprecedented in size from the one prior to it. So when you think about this, as everyone starts to panic a little bit and everyone starts to get intense, there's a human quality that social media has unfortunately amplified, which is our need and love for drama. And so what happens in these cycles is everybody's inner drama comes out and we look for the worst and we think of the worst. But the first thing I would say to you is take comfort in the fact that this is a pattern and it is a repeated, definable pattern. The key to the pattern that I think everyone is trying to grasp their heads around is, generally speaking, 90% of the world returns to normal. So this whole conversation that we get in now, will people go back into shopping malls? Will they go watch sports games again? Will they get on airplanes? The answer is yes. 100% they will do it. And the question is, in almost every single one of these circumstances, you see 90% of the world return to normal. Humans are quite elastic. Generally, 10% becomes what we think of, or what's always being overused as, the new normal. And in that context, you can take comfort in knowing that, like, generally speaking, while there will be economic damage and we will enter this devaluation period, that when we come out the other end on the growth cycle, generally things will return to normal. The art form, though, the key here is when you enter in this pattern, so you go from reset to devaluation to growth, 90% returns to normal, 10% becomes a new normal. And by the way, I'll give you an example of a new normal. If you go back to one of the last reset periods, which was 2008, look at the world of software. In 2006, 2007, the vast majority of software was sold through an enterprise license. But as we started to go through this period of devaluation, we ended up in a place where it became really expensive to have salespeople selling software. And all of a sudden in 2008, upwards into 2011 and 12 and up, you see the SaaS model become predominant. Almost no one sells enterprise licenses anymore. And it's an example of the thing that you have to watch for in all of this. And the thing you have to watch for in all of this is what happens in the growth cycle is that 10% new normal can begin to erode the 90% that was the normal. And so the art form is trying to figure out that 10% as it erodes that 90% over the growth cycle. The other thing that I would say you want to be really aware of, when we did our research on this, it was clear that a lot of the companies had one core fault. And if you went back over all these cycles and you looked at the graveyard of companies and organizations that failed or died, they all had their own reasons in some way. Some of them were idiosyncratic to technology, management teams, historical cycles, but they all shared one very particular similarity, which was something that we call a false historical bias. And we have to be very careful about that now, because what a false historical bias will do is it will force you to look with very, very severe blinders on without looking at a broader picture. Humans tend to be very, very short-sighted in their historical context, which is why I would encourage you, the most important thing I think any executive can do in this period of time is become a really astute student of this pattern and understanding the pattern, because once you understand it and your historical context is wider, you can start to begin to figure out what the behaviors are that end up making things successful for the companies that transition in these periods. And I would say to you, when we look at our industry, I spend, as Nick mentioned, the vast majority of my day is spent building new ventures and building companies and brands for celebrities. So I run a division of Creative Artists Agency, a joint venture with them, where we build a lot of the new ventures, things like Fit 5.2 with Carrie Underwood. And our group has been responsible for many brands with talent. And so we spend a lot of our time looking at these cycles and trying to figure out what is the right place to launch the right brand at the right moment. And I would say that there are a couple things, just to end off on, that you can do now. Things that are clearly definable that we see throughout these patterns that always repeat themselves. And the first thing I would tell you is breathe. This is going to be a pattern. We are in the midst of the confusion cycle now, where we are starting, everyone is trying to figure out exactly, it's like waking up in the morning and you're wiping off your eyes, trying to see clearly. We're in that phase, but it is very common to experience panic, but generally speaking, the calm is the best approach, because we will come out the other end. It is a pattern, and you will see that very clearly. I think the companies that we've watched have some really core tenets that help them survive these periods. Companies like John Deere, who ended up going from a hand tiller business selling basically rakes to betting on the combustion engine, which changed the way the world eats, to now betting on AI, being one of the only real level 5 autonomous vehicles in the field today. They're a great example of companies that survive these multiple rewrites of the planet. So the first thing I would say is, regardless of what you do for a living and regardless of the companies you work for, have a theory. What the public markets and private markets are rewarding now is not just performance. It's not just profitability. It's show me a theory of the world, show me how you're going to take me into that, make it believable, and drag me along with you. And you can see that in the masterclass in that is Elon Musk. Elon Musk has changed the way the public market dynamic and discourse happens. He has created a theory of the world, and he is dragging everyone with it. People with that theory, and Pippa referred to this earlier, and I agree with this 100%, now is the time for imagination, and the markets will reward that imagination, historically speaking. So it's really critical to have that theory of the world. Secondly, I would say the old adage of under promise, over deliver is no longer relevant. And I think, again, what is being rewarded is the companies that grossly overpromise and half deliver. Because generally speaking, it is the story of Apple. If you look at Apple as a context, when Apple delivers a product, you can watch at any given moment when they are pitching the product on whether it's the live event or their launches, or even when they're doing it without a face to it. The product is grossly overpromised. And generally when you get it, it's probably about half of what the promise was, but it's so much better than everyone else that it's good enough and the best, and you stay committed to the brand. It's the same experience with a lot of the great brands in the world. They tend to grossly overpromise. They half deliver, but that half delivery is so much better than everyone else, it just drags the market forward. So the real art form in closing up here, in my experience, that you really have to think about and you really have to be focused on is define that theory, make sure you understand clearly what you are promising, stretch those promises, and then ask the question, what is your 10%? So if 90% of the world is going to return to normal, the question is, what is the 10% that is the new normal in your particular sector? And you want to spend about 20 to 30% of your assets against that new normal during this period. The companies that come out of this in the growth period that are prepared, so once we are in the middle of the reset, you should be amalgamating the army as much as you can physically do from a CapEx perspective, time, human resource. You want to be prepared to look at that 10% new normal. You want to be ready that your capital is spent, focused, so that when the devaluation period begins, which is now starting, that you actually are in a place that you're able to be set when the growth cycle starts. So before, we used to say you want to be spending about 10% of your assets on this growth. I would argue that number is now closer to 20 to 30% of focusing on that 10% new normal that's going to change the industry. An example in our world, just before I close off here, an example in our world is we have been focused on building holographic entertainment for many, many years. And in my prior life, I was the chief innovation officer of one of the largest live event companies in the world, and we were the owners of Coachella. And we put Coachella on stage, and we put a holographic version of Tupac Shakur on stage. And it was kind of gimmicky, and it was interesting, and it generated a lot of buzz, and people were really amazed by how good the quality was. You know, if you fast forward 10 years, where we are now from that, you can see very clearly that one of the things that will come out of this reset, of this rewrite of the planet, is holographic and alternative forms of live are going to become very, very important. And you will see, certainly we spend a very large amount of our time thinking about what are the new channels of live performance, whether it's holographic, new forms of live entertainment delivered through home studios. All of these things that were sort of science fiction become accelerated. And that's the key, is we're going to enter into that acceleration period now, and that's what we're focused on. So get ready for another rewrite of the planet, but calm. This is a very definable, predictable pattern.
Leonard, thank you very, very much indeed for your time.